Oh my god, how many years has it been? Every few months, a major publication puts out an article about fantasy racism in Dungeons & Dragons. The all-time classic at this point is when people start claiming that orcs are a sort of dog-whistled portrayal of black people. Some of the popular posts from back in 2020 that did this are now for some reason missing. But you can find archives of a few, one with over 1,000 likes went like this: content warning for blatant racism. I'm in genuine awe that this shit came out for this edition of D&D. Attached was an excerpt, I'm not sure from where exactly, about role-playing as an orc. Most orcs have been indoctrinated into a life of destruction and slaughter. But unlike creatures who by their very nature are evil, such as gnolls, it's possible that an orc, if raised outside its culture, could develop a limited capacity for empathy, love, and compassion. No matter how domesticated an orc might seem, its bloodlust flows just beneath the surface. With its instinctive love of battle and its desire to prove its strength, an orc trying to live within the confines of civilization is faced with a difficult task. The point was that this description uses language similar to rhetoric that's been used against real people to dehumanize and justify aggression and violence against them. This part's true. Many populations of real people have been and are portrayed by some as being innately less civilized or as being prone to violence. The implication of this point, though, that the use of such language in any context reinforces acceptance of that characterization of human beings, was of course the issue. Use of this language towards real groups of people isn't wrong because using that language is wrong. It's wrong because it's incorrect. And it's evil because it's done to justify harming people. A sourcebook's characterization of a fantasy race isn't propaganda against a demographic that isn't really like that. It's the very creation of that group. That fantasy and a non-human appearance is required to make a group like this exist, contrary to reinforcing real-life racial bias, reinforces the idea that beings like this aren't real, and thereby undermines the very rhetoric it reflects. Particularly since, in the settings of D&D canon, humans exist, and within the pretend human race exists all the variety you'd find in the real human race, i.e., when you take the setting as a whole. The message is that such language as found in the aforementioned excerpt explicitly does not apply to humans of any kind. Now, before I keep going, I've gotta admit, I'm no lore scholar, but I think even my surface knowledge is enough for what comes next. The other point that came up, and still comes up, is that even if you accept that, simply being exposed to this kind of writing will make you more comfortable with seeing these words in any context when you should be repulsed. Idea being that the Monster Manual is a gateway to dubious race science. The problem here is that, even with the large degree of ambiguity that exists to allow people using source texts to still have flexibility, magic definitely exists, gods definitely exist. Orcs don't have a tendency towards brutality because of their race. Their race has a tendency toward brutality because of its connection to Gruumsh. The player's handbook says he literally whispers to them in their dreams. That shit ain't genetic. Additionally, the excerpt that made the rounds back in the day says, in its first sentence, that they are indoctrinated into a life of destruction. And I know for sure I've read about groups of nomadic orcs, not tamed by civilized races, but simply separate from their more fanatical brethren, who are much more chill. It's the ones who've grown up in a culture that embrace Gruumsh who need straightening out or dealing with after going feral. Here's something else. The Monster Manual references an orc creation story. Is it 100% true even in world? I can't be sure. But essentially it details Gruumsh looking for a territory to call his own, but finding out everywhere has been claimed and he was left with nothing. The orcs are then created as vengeance, his way of reaching out and taking what he was denied. Sounds a bit more colonizer than colonized to me personally. With all this in mind, the characterization of orcs in the passage we looked at could be said to parallel a cult more than it does propaganda against a real race or ethnicity. The -2 to intelligence they used to have in official material could even be interpreted as a consequence of the interference of Gruumsh limiting their intellectual growth, rather than having worse brains. I'd say that contrary to contributing to prejudice, orcs as a creation do everything possible to avoid stigmatizing actual people, as their vulnerability to barbaric religious zealotry could have come from something that reflects real-life mental illness. But instead, it's more like a curse. Everything has been done to not make them a clear stand-in for something in real life, which is actually incredibly difficult, because if you ever say anything bad, I guarantee it's been said about a group of people. We have treated each other like utter shit. So anyway, that's orcs. But over time, dark elves, or drow, were thrown into the bucket of problematic toys. Earlier this month, The Independent published an article titled, "Can Dungeons & Dragons Banish Its Racism Problem?" Spoiler, it's an ad. I mean, it's not labeled as an ad, but that's what it is. The whole point of the article is to show off that a new book's coming out. I've got to say, Wizards of the Coast's "We're racist and that needs to change" method of self-promotion is incredible. We foster white supremacy. Buy our book we got brown people to make, and help fix us by giving us money. Takes some real fucking balls to commit to that, but people are applauding them, so well played, I guess. Back to the article. The author says that many in the gaming community are expressing unease at dark elves being portrayed as inherently stupid, brutish, and evil. Brutish and evil, sure. I don't think they're stupid. They're all about scheming. But even then, inherently? Before I'd even looked into D&D, years and years ago, I'd heard of Drizzt Do'Urden. Maybe he's been eclipsed in popularity by player-made characters from popular podcasts, but he's gotta still be up there in recognizability. And he's a heroic drow, a dark elf who disavows the society he came from. Are you gonna call him an Uncle Tom? That's fucking weird. And far from the depiction of drow paralleling unjust real-world characterizations of minorities or indigenous people, as you could somewhat reasonably argue for orcs' descriptions, the drow are fucking subterranean Nazis, spider Nazis. They're a cult with a eugenics program. They're gonna tend towards evil, not just because of their god Lolth's influence, but because if you're not evil, you're fucked. Born underground, into a matriarchal society that rewards subterfuge and assassination. If you're a soft boy, you're gonna A. die, B. adapt and become evil because you have to survive, or C. escape, if you're so lucky as to live long enough and have the capability and will by that point, without losing your way. It is spider-pilled social Darwinism. If there's a group dark elves are gonna make people biased against in real life, it's neo-Nazis. I can approach and treat the arguments about orcs in good faith, but the drow are racist people? It's because they typically have dark skin and do bad stuff, right? It's that dumb, isn't it? In the end, of course, none of this matters. I mean, obviously, it's books that guide you on playing make-believe with dice. Even if you're a nerd though, canon for tabletop doesn't matter. You can just do it differently if they change something you don't like. Even if you don't have time to come up with a whole setting, tweaking what's there is effortless. With the amount of content surrounding what can be found in sourcebooks, you don't even need to resort to piracy to get most of what you'd want to draw from them, without paying anything either. Once you're comfortable with the idea of tabletop role-playing, especially if you're more oriented towards being a DM, what even is an official book? A license to use your imagination? Guidelines on what's okay to make up in your head? I don't need that. Maybe the people who view fantasy this way do, though. Fair enough. Enjoy your new products. But, as usual, that's just another one of my harmful opinions.